Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah chapter 5, Halacha 1. We're going to get into a bit of an unusual Mishnah and Gemara, a little bit cryptic. The Mishnah is going to talk about situations where the ears of leket become mingled with the landowner's grain, but this is before the poor people collect them. There's going to be two cases. One is where the landowner puts piles of grain on top of the leket for the poor before they pick it up, and they do it on purpose. And the other case is where they do it by accident. So what's going to happen when they're concealing something that really belongs to the poor? It doesn't belong to them. It's technically not their property. They don't have ownership of it. So this is also going to end up with a dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel in today's part. And then in tomorrow's part, we're going to talk about the Sanhedrin and with Hefker. So the Mishnah starts off and says that if there is a grain pile from under which the leket has not yet been gathered, all the ears that touch the ground belong to the poor. So basically, the owner piled the grain, the cut grain, on a portion of the field, and the poor didn't pick it up yet. They didn't pick up the leket. And now the leket ears are covered and become mixed up with the owner's pile of produce. That's what the first case is talking about. And then the owner, he has to remove the grain from here and leave the entire bottom layer to the poor. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Matanos Aniyim 4:6 that although this amounts to much more than the amount of leket that was covered by a pile, the owner must remove his grain from here and leave the entire bottom layer. The Gemara later is going to explain what's going on here, that the poor are getting a greater amount. How could this be? The Mishnah continues, says, if, however, the wind scattered the owner's sheaves over a portion of the field from which the leket had yet to be gathered, we estimate how much leket the field would be expected to yield, and the owner gives that amount to the poor. So the owner had piled up the sheaves in a place that was free of leket. The wind comes along, blows it, and the sheaves get scattered around, and it scatters over actual ears of leket, that those ones over there had been left to the poor to take. So now it gets intermingled, and it's unknown which ear in particular belongs to the owner and which ear in particular belongs to the poor. So the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in his Biurim in Safe 99 says like this. He says, it was common for the reapers to tie the produce in small bundles soon after it was cut, and since these bundles would later be opened and combined into large sheaves, they were tied loosely so that it would not be unusual for the wind to scatter them. However, some understand the Mishnah is referring to unbound sheaves. So this is a case where it's just getting mixed. It's not intentional. And now what do you do about it? It's a real world case. Who owns it? Because why should you care? And I'll tell you why. Because one part is owned by someone else and one part is owned by another person. That sheaf that blew over, that's owned by the landowner. And the other part, halakhically, is owned by the poor person. So you have a case now where it's mixed up with two distinct ownerships. So the Torah lays out that you, in processing your field, the leket, you don't own it. It's owned by the poor in all cases, and that it's not yours. It's just not yours. And that's really the key idea here, is that it gets the ownership gets mixed up. So the Mishnah finishes up, and it says that Rabban Gamliel says he gives to the poor the amount that normally falls. So the case that we're talking about, we have only an estimated amount of leket that's covered by scattered sheaves that has to be given to the poor. It's not the entire bottom layer. However, the amount of leket that's covered and mixed up might be unknown. And considering that there are various factors that affect the amount of leket that a field can yield, so for example, less ears fall from a well-watered field than from a dry one. So then what will happen is a court will come and make an individual assessment of each field in which, you know, after such an incident occurred where, the wind comes and blows and all the sheaves get all mixed up. And this is not talking about the wind blowing one or two sheaves. This is talking about a very, very strong wind that blows away a lot of the crops and it's all mixed up. So much so that they have to call a Beit Din to figure out how to sort it out. So the point by Rabban Gamliel is he's saying that a court doesn't have to make an individual assessment for each and every field in which such an incident occurs where there's a huge strong wind and now it's blown all of the sheaves before they're all piled up. Maybe they're untied, or maybe they're loosely tied, and it's all over the place. And Rabban Gamliel's point is that rather they assess all the fields at the rate that leket falls from an average field. So they're going to try to focus on this contrast between the law in the Mishnah's first case and the law in the second case. Because again, you have something where something is done on purpose and something is done by accident. So the Gemara reads, here, in the case where the wind scattered the sheaves over the uncollected leket, you say that we estimate how much leket the field would be expected to yield, and the owner gives that amount to the poor and no more. The Gemara continues and says, whereas here, in the case of a grain pile that was uncollected leket beneath it, you say that all the ears that touch the ground belong to the poor, even though some of them are obviously not leket. So the Gemara is trying to figure out, why are these two cases treated differently? Part of it where it gets put on top of the uncollected leket, it's obviously not leket. So by the way, what is it, right? But what is it, and why are these two things different? So the Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Abahu says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of a grain pile, the rabbis impose a penalty upon the landowner for having piled his grain upon the leket of the poor. So basically, they're gonna put in a penalty. And why are they putting in a penalty? Because they require him to give the poor all the ears that are touching the ground. And in the case where the leket is covered by an act of nature, he's not going to be penalized because he didn't mean to do it. But here, he has to compensate the poor for their leket that gets mingled with the grain. So when you pile up your own grain on top of leket, you mingle the two, and you're preventing the poor people from collecting it. And so for this reason, he's penalized and he's forced to give them everything that touched the ground. And generally, this is the entire amount that is intermingled, since the leket is going to be lying on the ground. It's not going to be piled high. So I want to point out something from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in Safe 79 in his shiurim. He's saying that we learned that questionable leket is deemed leket, and it would seem that even without a penalty, the poor should be allowed to take all the mingled grain, whatever is touching the ground, since all of it is questionable leket. But in truth, they are not entitled to do so, for although each ear that is touching the ground might be a leket ear, it is obvious that not all the ears touching the ground are leket. Rather, under the strict rule of law, we would estimate how much leket this field produced, and the poor would receive that amount, as in the Mishnah's later case. However, we penalize the landowner for piling his grain on the leket, and the rabbis require him to leave for the poor everything that is touching the ground, each and every ear that is possible leket. So the rabbis put in this penalty to stop people from, well, basically as a fence to make sure that people are going to be careful to not pile things on top of leket, and to not trample on the rights of the poor people. It's a very amazing idea that this is not questionable leket. This is not questionable leket like what we were talking about before, that this is halakhically two distinct ownerships. This part here has distinct ownership by the landowner. This has distinct ownership by the poor. So the part that's owned by the landowner, that's not questionable. That's not questionable leket. You're just not sure which is which. It's mixed up. And that's going to be different from a case with the ants, where the ants could have taken something that could have fallen during harvest, and you're not sure if that was taken during harvest or before harvest. But this part here has two different ownerships, and that's the difference. So the Gemara is going to try to figure out the scope of this penalty, which is a big chiddush. And the Gemara reads, "Thus far we may assume only that they penalize one who piles his grain upon the leket intentionally. And what is the law requiring one who does so inadvertently?" So the Rosh Cirillo points out that since it was explained in the Mishnah's rule that it represents a penalty, it seems reasonable to assume that this rule pertains only to one who intentionally piled his grain upon the uncollected leket of the poor. But does the penalty extend to one who piled his grain in a certain spot, not knowing there was leket beneath it? How we're actually going to penalize the owner, even if he piled his grain upon the uncollected leket inadvertently. And why is that? Because, as Amara Fulda points out, we're trying to stop him from doing it intentionally and pretending like he did it on accident. And we see that throughout the Shas, where it'll look like, the rule comes up again and again, where they want to stop, the rabbis want to stop dishonesty, where people can cheat and come along and say, oh yeah, I was actually doing it on purpose, but pretending like I didn't really want to, so that I can get out of it. So now what's going to happen in other cases? So the Gemara reads, "Moreover, we penalize him even if he piled bundles of grain upon the uncollected leket, and even if he piled wheat upon uncollected leket ears of barley, or vice versa." That's a big chiddush. It's a big chiddush. How can it be that now, you see, okay, which property is which? This is barley, this is wheat. So the Vilna Gaon, he points out that although the owner's bundles, do not commingle with the strewn leket, such that the poor, is still able to identify what's theirs and take it, we obligate him to leave these ears with his bundles that touch the ground. And the reason, says the Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, is that the owner is penalized even in the case that the rabbis impose their penalty across the board, so that whenever the owner piled grain on the leket, without distinction whether it means the leket is unidentifiable or not. So this would be a case where, yeah, this leket is definitely identifiable. You can tell which one is leket for sure. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is pointing out in his shiurim that the rabbis didn't distinguish whether it was identifiable or not. It's just a rule across the board that you have to leave it. So that's really a big chiddush here. The Vilna Gaon, getting into this idea of wheat on top of barley, the Vilna Gaon is going to state that this represents an even greater novelty, since the piled grain is of an entirely different species than the leket ears, so there's not even a possibility of mingling. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is going to address that in detail in his shiurim on Seif 96, and he suggests that if the owner piled only bundles of grain on the scattered leket ears, he is not penalized, since there's no mingling at all. Rather, what the Gemara states, even if he piled bundles, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says it means that if he piled some loose ears on the leket and he also piled bundles on it, he is penalized not only with respect to the loose ears that are touching the ground, but also with respect to the portions of the bundles that are touching the ground. And once the penalty is triggered by the mingling of the owner's loose ears with the leket, it is applied to everything that he piled upon the leket, including the bundles. So according to this approach, it's understandable why the case of wheat piled on barley represents such a big novelty, and even a bigger novelty than the last case, where the owner's grain and the leket are of the same species. So in the previous case, there was at least some of the owner's grain mingled with the leket, and that made it identifiable. You couldn't figure out whose property was what. But the big chiddush here is that the poor can easily figure out what is the difference between barley ears and wheat ears, and collect the grains that are theirs on their own. And the Gemara is informing us, saying that nevertheless, since the mingling of the wheat and barley creates a difficulty for the poor, this is going to suffice to trigger the penalty. And that's the big chiddush. In Rambam's Matanos Aniyim, chapter 4, Halacha 7, the Rambam cites all the laws mentioned here, but admits the case in which the person piled bundles upon the loose ears of leket. So that's really interesting, because although they may be somewhat at fault, the poor people might be somewhat at fault for not collecting the leket. They have no right to pile grain. So, in other words, even if the poor people were slow to collect and slow to come out to the field, maybe they were late, the farmer still does not have the right to pile grain on it and make it difficult for the poor to come and collect it. And that's also a big chiddush. You could come along and say that, oh, well, the poor didn't come to collect. They're 3 hours late. They're 5 hours late. It's getting in the way. I'm having a hard time operating, and I'm just going to pile it and not worry about it. No, you're not getting out of it. Like, you're still somewhat at fault. So that's also a big chiddush here. The idea of a grain pile from under which the leket has not been gathered, this is going to imply that the law is applicable no matter how the grain becomes piled there, whether it's intentionally or inadvertently or through even other people who did it without the owner's knowledge. So that's also a big hiddush. Let me reread this Gemara again. So it says that, um, moreover, we penalize him even if he piled bundles of grain upon the uncollected leket, and even if he piled wheat upon uncollected ears of barley, or vice versa, and even if others piled the owner's grain upon the uncollected leket without his knowledge, and even if before piling his produce in this place, he called the poor to come to collect the leket, and they did not come. So that's also a big chiddush that you don't get out of it by simply saying, "Okay, I called, I gave notice, and they didn't come, so now I'm just gonna go and pile on top of it." That also doesn't get you out, and that's also a big chiddush. So the Gemara is gonna continue, and before it had been explained that the ruling awarding all the ears touching the ground, uh, you know, going to the poor represents a rabbinic penalty that's going to get imposed on the landowner. That's also a big hiddush. Now, since many of those ears are not actual leket, they do not assume the special tithing exempt status that the Torah assigns to leket. Nevertheless, it can be inferred from the Mishnah that these ears are treated like leket, and the poor are not required to tithe them. The Gemara is going to try to focus on this point because that's going to be a big question. I want before we start, I want to look at something from the Vilna Gaon, and he says like this. It says, when the owner complies with the rabbinic penalty and leaves the extra ears for the poor, they will not necessarily know that he left more than what is biblically required. Most likely, the poor will assume that whatever was left on the ground is actual leket, and they will consume it without separating the required tithes. Thus, by imposing a penalty on the landowner, the rabbis ultimately cause the poor to eat this produce in an untithed state. Since it is inconceivable that the rabbis would issue a decree that would lead the poor to violate the prohibition of tevel, we must conclude that these stalks are not actual leket, and there's some other reason for tithe exempt status. So the Mara Fulda points out that another way to look at the Mishnah is merely that whatever touches the ground belongs to the poor, and it does not state that they must tithe it, as it states regarding leket, shchicha, and peah of a non-Jew's field. It implies that this produce is exempt from tithes. So this is going to be a big hiddush because something's going on here where this thing that's definitely not leket but gets mixed up with it is going to somehow maybe get exempt from tithes. So how can that be? What's going on here? So the Gemara reads that Rabbi Immi said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, our Mishnah, which awards all the ears touching the ground to the poor and indicates these ears are exempt from the tithing requirements, reflects the view of Bet Shammai, and that's a big hiddush. Maybe that this whole Mishnah is really reflecting the view of Bet Shammai, and that in itself is a big hiddush. So the Gemara continues and says, for Bet Shammai said that produce declared ownerless just for the poor is in fact hefker, and that exempts him from tithes. I want to point out a note by the Rosh on the Mishnah. The Rosh says like this. He says, the produce that is hefker is exempt from the Meiser obligations. Bet Shammai's state in the Mishnah is that if one declares his produce to be hefker for the poor, in other words, people can come and take it for any poor person, but not for any rich people, his declaration has legal standing, according to Bet Shammai. The produce becomes freely available for acquisition by the poor, but not by the rich, and it becomes exempt from miser, just like produce that is unconditionally hefker. Now, Bet Hillel argues and maintains that an owner's declaration of hefker has no legal effect if the declaration limits the potential of acquisition to a certain class of people. And therefore, if someone declared produce to be hefker for the poor, it does not become hefker at all, and it is not exempt from miser, nor is it available for acquisition even by the poor. In other words, according to Bet Hillel, that even the poor people can't take it because it's not hefker and it's not a valid statement and it still belongs to the person. The person who made the declaration didn't get rid of it, and that's why the poor people can't come and collect it with that sort of faulty declaration, according to Bet Hillel's opinion. So, according to Bet Shammai, the produce that the owner leaves for the poor is in compliance with this rabbinic penalty. While it's not actual leket, it is exempt from tithes, since he has in effect left it hefker and free for acquisition by any poor person. So, according to Bet Shammai, it has the same status as full-fledged hefker, and that statement has caused ownership to transfer from the person who originally owned it to being in a state of free for all, or free for just the poor, according to Bet Shammai, and not the rich. But that still affects a valid statement. So, according to Bet Hillel holds that the produce declared hefker just for the person is not hefker. It is subject to tithes, and any produce left by the owner in compliance with the rabbinic penalty would be subject to tithes. So this Mishnah does not fit with Bet Hillel's opinion. And in fact, as we had just mentioned, that statement of Bet Hillel, where somebody comes and makes a conditional statement of Hefker, this class of people can take it, but this class cannot. That, according to Bet Hillel, that is not a declaration for Hefker, and he hasn't said anything, and he actually hasn't even transferred ownership from himself to anybody. So it's definitely not Hefker, definitely not free for anybody to take. That's a very big distinction. Rabbi Imi's interpretation is going to get rejected, and Rabbi Yassa says to him, we have heard a tradition from our teachers that all the grain touching the ground is exempt from tithes, according to all, including Bet Hillel, on account of the rabbinically imposed penalty. So that's also a big hiddush. It's also a big hiddush that he's saying, Rabbi Yassa is saying, that this is a rabbinic penalty and exempt from tithes. And the Gemara is going to continue to say, although Bet Hillel holds that ordinarily something declared hefker specifically for the poor is not hefker, they agree that here that the grain touching the ground is hefker. For that which is declared hefker by the court is hefker in any event. And so in this reading, the Mishnah does fit even with the opinion of Bet Hillel. So I just want to look at the Mara Fulda for some help on, helping to explain this. Mara Fulda says that while Bet Hillel holds that an individual does not have the capacity to declare his property hefker for the poor, they agree that when the rabbis declare property hefker for the poor, under their power of hefker of the Beit Din is hefker, their decree does take effect. And in our case, therefore, the produce touching the ground becomes hefker for the poor by virtue of the rabbinical decree and is exempt from miser like all hefker. In other words, that this is not true hefker like somebody leaving it out. That there's already a hefker of the Beit Din. In other words, the Beit Din has already declared this property to be in this status. And that's really what's happening here, right? This statement, the statement in fact is really irrelevant. By the person coming along and doing it, it's the Beit Din that already declared this to be Hefker, not the person who comes and does this action. And the person who comes and does his action, he's actually waiving it. It's actually falling into this class of Hefker by Beit Din. So his statement isn't what's causing it to be Hefker. His action of putting it like this on top of the leket, that's what's causing it to fall into Hefker. And what's making it the Hefker is not his statement, it's the Hefker that of the Beit Din by the rabbis. That's what's causing it to be Hefker. That's what's going on here. So the Vilna Gaon is gonna help explain this as well. It's going to say that even the Beit Din does not have the capacity to declare something Hefker specifically to the poor. What Rabbi Yossi means is that the rabbinic penalty actually made the ears touching the ground Hefker in the full sense for rich and poor alike, and this is why they are exempt from Meiser even according to Bet Hillel, says the Vilna Gaon. Vilna Gaon continues, says the Mishnah nevertheless states that they belong to the poor because in practice no rich person will take them, since intermingled among them is leket ears that are indistinguishable from the rest, and the rich are not entitled to these ears, says the Vilna Gaon. The Rosh Cirillo has another point. The Rosh Cirillo is pointing out that the rabbis, under their power of Hefker Beit Din, at first declared the ears that touch the ground Hefker for both rich and poor alike, thus rendering these ears exempt from Meiser, and immediately thereafter grant them to the poor, which prevents the rich from taking them. And the Pnei Moshe's argument or statement is that in any event, the ears touching the ground, though available only to the poor, are exempt from the Meiser requirements under the category of Hefker. So the Gemara is going to seek this source for the principle that the court has the power to declare property Beit Din. And the Gemara reads, and from where is it known that what is declared Hefker by the court is Hefker? And the Gemara answers, and it says, for it is written, and whoever does not come within 3 days as proposed by the princes and the elders, all his property shall be forfeit. And where do we see that? We see that in Ezra chapter 10, Pasuk 8, and over there, the story goes like this. It says, Ezra wants to get the people to get rid of the non-Jewish wives, and they came into the land with the non-Jewish wives. He wants to kick them out. And Ezra and all the leaders of the men of the Great Assembly, they issue a call that all the returning exiles will gather in Jerusalem within 3 days, or they suffer the forfeiture of their property. So this is what the Yerushalmi is saying is the source for where we see in the Tanakh that the court, and this case is the men of the Great Assembly, that they have the power to declare property to be Hefker and forfeited and waived. And tomorrow we're going to get into another big Hiddush about this power of the Beit Din. I just want to finish up talking about the scope of the court's power in this regard. So the Sugya asks, it says, from where do we know that produce declared Hefker by the court is exempt from the requirement of tithes? And that's a good question, because now we're worried that, hey, maybe these people are going to be eating tevel. There's a big problem for that. Pnei Moshe says that the Baraisa from which we can prove that produce declared Hefker by a Beit Din is exempt from Meiser is is actually our Mishnah. And according to the traditional interpretation, says the Pnei Moshe, that Rabbi Yosei cites in the name of the teachers, Rabbi Yasa cites in the name of the teachers, holds that the produce declared Hefker by Beit Din is actually exempt from Meiser. So the produce declared Hefker by Beit Din is exempt, and the Gemara is going to try to make this point. And it's interesting that it's not the person's statement that when you pile it on top of the leket and he tries to make it Hefker. That's not what's triggering it. It's really the proof for how we know there's Hefker by Beit Din is in this Mishnah, and it's the action that does it, and it's triggering this ruling by the Beit Din, by the Gedolim, by the sages, that this property now is Hefker, and it's not a person coming and doing it. There's now rule that is inside of the Halacha, and then once you cross that action, now you've come and triggered this Hefker by Beit Din. The Chazon Ish, in his commentary in Kalayim 116, says that this ruling proves that the courts are vested with the power to declare a person's property Hefker, and the Gemara is going to try to come and look at where is a source for this rule, and try to shed some light on whether produce of a field can be declared Hefker by a Beit Din, and that if that's going to be exempt from Meiser like ordinary Hefker. And the discussion is going to really dig into this Mishnah and Rabbi Yasa, or in the Bavli, Rabbi Yosei's traditional interpretation of it. So the Gemara's question, which we just asked, it seems difficult to understand since we have a scriptural source teaching that Hefker is exempt from Meiser. We have a scriptural source teaching that the Beit Din has the power to declare property Hefker. So why should there be any doubt whether Hefker rendered by a declaration of Beit Din is exempt from Meiser? And I just want to point out something by the Rosh Cirillo. He's going to explain that the produce ought to qualify for the same exemption from Meiser as ordinary Hefker. But since the Beit Din declares it Hefker against the will of the owner, who desires to preserve his biblical right of ownership, it is exempt from Meiser. Or if it is exempt from Meiser, the Beit Din will be seen as uprooting the biblical Meiser requirement. That's the problem, says the Rosh Cirillo. In other words, the Beit Din will be seen as allowing the act of consumption of what appears to be tevel, even though the Beit Din has not authorized it. And the Beit Din is not authorized to actively uproot any law in the Torah. So the produce has to be treated as subject to Meiser despite its court-imposed state of ownerlessness, says the Rosh Cirillo. The Chazon Ish has a really interesting insight in his commentary on Shvius 19, Halacha 24. It says that the Chazon Ish, his explanation of why the produce the court declares Hefker might be subject to tithing is that although Scripture indicates that the Beit Din is empowered to make a person's property forfeit, perhaps this perhaps does not mean that the Beit Din can actually change the title of the property and render it ownerless. They can actually remove it from the owner's domain, and possibly the Beit Din only has the authority to abrogate the owner's exclusive right to the property and thereby open the door for anyone to seize it without violating the prohibition of stealing, but the property remains the original owner's property until somebody actually takes it. And if so, produce declared ownerless by the Beit Din would never be hefker or ownerless in the true sense. It would merely be available for all to take like ownerless property, and such produce therefore would not qualify for the exemption from Meiser that pertains to true hefker. And in consideration of this possibility, the Gemara seeks confirmation that produce declared hefker by a Beit Din is in fact exempt from Meiser. So that's going to be talked about tomorrow. We're gonna try to figure out what is the source of this, of what do we do with this this produce, because we don't want them to eat tevel, and maybe they're going to assume that it's leket. Maybe it was done and they didn't even know about it. We don't want them to come and eat tevel later. So we have to really figure out how does it work with the hefker by Beit Din, and whether it's going to be tithed or not, and how are we going to get around this so that we don't have people eating tevel. So stay tuned tomorrow, and we'll finish up the halacha tomorrow.